So this is our study guide for Chapter 4. As you can see, we are talking about the colonies in North America were established for religious and economic reasons. The geographic features, resources, social life, and political and civic life influence life in the colonies. We have natural resources, human resources, and capital resources. We remember this from Chapter 2. Things that come directly from nature are natural resources. People working to produce goods and services are human resources. And goods produced and used to make other goods and services are capital resources. So for instance, wood, rocks, water, those are natural resources. We get them from nature. Human resources would be like a hunter, a teacher, a politician. Capital resources are things like houses, hammers, fishing rods. Those are things that we use to do things with. Every one of these colonies had an economic specialization which made them interdependent on each other. So, for instance, in New England, they would make things like naval supplies, ships, and in the South, they would have cash crops, and they were interdependent because the things like tobacco and indigo were wanted by people in New England, and they were willing to trade their naval supplies to the South for those things. So each colony had a specialization that's a focus on producing one product or a few products, and interdependence are two or more people depending on others. It's when you depend on people, you're interdependent. Great Britain established and attempted to maintain control over the colonies. Economic relationship with Great Britain. Great Britain imposed strict control over trade. They didn't want the colonies having their own trade. Great Britain taxed the colonies after the French and Indian War. That's where we get taxation without representation. The colonies traded raw materials for goods made in Britain. So what was happening with the relationship with the colonies is that the colonies would send, let's say, tobacco to England, and England would turn them into cigars and then sell them back to the colonies. And they would make a lot of money off of each other, and Britain would make even more money with this type of trade. They could take those cigars and sell them anywhere. But the trade really went, it was focused on Great Britain. The colonies were not really allowed to trade with France or any other country. They had to come to Britain first and sell their stuff to Great Britain, which gave Great Britain first dibs on whatever came out of the colonies. The colonists had to obey British laws, which were enforced by the governors. Colonial governors were appointed by the king or proprietor. And we have another branch of government called the colonial legislatures, who made the laws for each of the colony, but was monitored by the colonial governor. Remember, we talked about the colonial governors having a lot of power where they could not approve laws at the legislature. They had to approve the laws in order for the law to become the law of the land. And so that gave the governors a lot of power. They couldn't write the law, but they could stop a law from happening if they didn't like it. All right. Then we have the New England colonies. Okay, so why they were established. Plymouth, basically, you could just look at it. The colonies in the north, like New England, they were religious. Okay, they did not like the Church of England, and the Church of England, frankly, didn't like them, so they came here to America. It is cold there. It has moderate summers, cold winters. They have the Appalachian Mountains, but you'll find out that Appalachian Mountains are in all the colonies. They have good harbors, hilly terrain, rocky soil, and jagged coastline. So because of this rocky soil and cold winters and shorter summers, they couldn't farm as much as the other colonies. They did have farms, but they couldn't farm as much as the other colonies are going to have tremendous farms. Whereas New England's going to have to rely more on the water. That's why they have things like fish are their resources. They go fishing, they build things. They have skilled craftsmen, fishermen, merchants, shipbuilders, and they would make tools and buildings in New England. That was their specialty. They were very, very religious, so the church was the center of their life. And because they centered most of their life around the church, they would have town meetings in the church over what kind of laws they want for the town. Um, and their specialization was fishing, shipbuilding, naval supplies, metal tools, and equipment. Uh, they depended on the other colonies for crops from the mid-Atlantic and cash crops like tobacco, rice, and cotton and indigo from the south. Okay, so the mid-Atlantic colonies were settled in Pennsylvania by Quakers, and they came here also for religious reasons. They wanted the freedom to practice their faith without interference. Of course, the Appalachian Mountains were there. Coastal plains. Remember, the coastal plain is the whole region that we're talking about here, next to the Appalachian Mountains. They have also everybody's going to have great harbors. They have deep, wide rivers there, which make movement easy for these farmers to send and people to send their goods to these major cities like Philadelphia and New York City. Their climate is moderate. Remember, they're the baby bear of climate. Not too hot, not too cold. You know, you got the cold in New England and the hot in the South. But in the Mid-Atlantic, it's moderate. They have rich farmland, rivers. They have unskilled and skilled workers, so people were still needed in the cities to build things. But with all the work, a lot of unskilled people could find work, like lifting bags or barrels and loading up ships and so forth. They had farmers, fishermen, merchants. Basically, when you're talking about the Mid-Atlantic, you're talking about food. And you'll see that here on their specialization. They specialize in livestock, grains, and fish. Of course, they had tools and buildings there. Their social life centered around the villages and cities. So they're going to have market towns where they make their laws. They're very diverse. This is a big word here. Diverse cultural backgrounds, diverse religions. And that's because of the more open society that were set by the Quakers. They learned their lesson from England that persecuting people is not a good idea. Puritans in New England, let me go back to New England. The Puritans, the ones that settled in New England, they didn't really learn their lesson. That's where we get Rhode Island. See, in Massachusetts, they were Puritan. They believed that you had to be very strict with your religious ideas, and they were so strict, some people had to leave and settle in Rhode Island and make a whole new colony. But in the Mid-Atlantic, they were very open, so you find many different cultures, backgrounds, religions, people from all over the world and mostly Europe, but different European countries would come to New York and Philadelphia, so you'd see a lot of diversity. Then we get to the southern colonies. That would be Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. And let me just recap that the Mid-Atlantic are New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and anything above New York is New England, and that would be Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. All right, so let me go back to the southern. The southern were Roanoke Island, Jamestown, and Georgia. They are about money. They want to make money. They want to get rich. So they settle these plantations, and it makes sense because they're going to specialize in cash crops, tobacco, rice, indigo. So remember, they're about money, money crops, cash crops, and that's what the South is all about when they're settled. Georgia's a little bit different. They wanted to make money, but Georgia was set up with the idea that people that were in jail for owing people money could get out of jail and come to Georgia to be an indentured servant and work off their debts that way. It is very hot there. Of course, Appalachian Mountains. Piedmont. Remember the Piedmont. Pied meaning foot, mont meaning mountain, foot of the mountain, is very, very fertile land. So they're able to, with the humid climate, they're able to grow things like tobacco, where tobacco can't be grown in most other places. They have plantations, mansions. Remember, there are people that are very, very rich living on these mansions and also very, very poor living and working on these plantations. Because the plantations were so large, everybody's spread out, so there's few cities and few schools. which meant that only rich kids could get an education, which meant that the poor kids were going to, um, they were just going to have to work in the fields. There was no way around it. They couldn't learn anything, so they were going to end up working in the fields like their parents, whether they were free or slave. They believed in the Church of England. You have the Puritans in New England. You have a diversity in the Mid-Atlantic, but in the South, they didn't come here for religious reasons. So they still subscribe to the Church of England, which is what they believed back in England, obviously. They set their laws by counties. Remember, we have counties here in the South. We're set up in counties. I mean, counties are everywhere, but that's how they would make laws. People would go to the county, set up counties so that they would have laws set by that instead of going to a town and discussing what kind of laws there should be. Okay, let's go to the next page. All right. And then finally, we've got the different types of people here. We have large landowners. They mostly lived in the South. They relied on indentured servants and or enslaved African Americans for labor. They were educated, especially if they were rich, and had a rich social culture. Well, I mean, they were all pretty much rich, but the richer you were, the more chance you had in education. They had a rich social culture, a lot of parties, a lot of social gatherings. Farmers, they worked the land according to the region. So if you were a farmer in the South, you probably grew tobacco or some other cash crop. If you lived in the Mid-Atlantic or even New England, you probably grew food. Relied on family members for labor. So remember we talked about the children would work on the farm. You know, your parents owned a farm and everybody helped out on the farm. That was what everybody did. No matter how old you were, you helped the family on the farm. Artisans, they worked as craftsmen in towns and on plantations. So they needed to be where most people are, or at least people with money. They lived in small villages and cities because the more people are there, the more people could hire them because they would just do their job and then they were done. They weren't working on the field constantly. They had a job to do, build something, create something, and then that was it. Their job was over. Merchants worked to buy and sell goods to the colonists. They lived in towns and cities. Again, they needed to be where many people are. The more people pass by your shop, the more money you can make because people see your products and then they come in. If there's only 2 people that come by each day and one of them walks in, that's only one customer. But if you have 100 people walk by each day and 10 people come into your store, then you're selling things to a lot more people. So the more people that pass by your store, the better off you're going to be. Then we have women and free African Americans. I'm going to put them together because this is a good comparison of how you should be looking at these people. Women worked as caretakers, houseworkers, and homemakers. They were not allowed to vote and had few opportunities for getting education. Free African Americans were similar in a sense that they were not allowed to vote. However, they were able to own land, unlike women, and had economic freedom and could work for pay and decide how to spend their money. So free African American males had more freedoms than women did. The only thing that they really had in common was that they were both not allowed to vote. Indentured servants and enslaved African Americans are also coupled together because they're very similar. Indentured servants were men and women who did not have the money for passage to the colonies and who agreed to work without pay for the person who paid for their passage, and also were free at the end of their contract. So this is the main difference here, is that indentured servants chose to do this work, even though the work was very similar, whereas the enslaved African Americans did not choose this life. They didn't choose to go into slavery. They were captured in native Africa and sold to slave traders, then shipped to the colonies where they were sold into slavery. They were owned as property for life and did not have any rights. Children were born into slavery when we're talking about the Virginia law that started all that. And so whenever a child was born to slavery, they now became slaves. Whereas the indentured servants just had to fill out their contract and then they were free. So slaves would never be free. Indentured servants eventually would be free. The indentured servants chose this life, the slaves did not.